The red barn had stood on Morrison property for over 100 years, weathered and forgotten until Sarah and Tom decided it would make the perfect family home. What started as a simple renovation in rural Nebraska quickly became something far more sinister. Behind the rotting wood panels, they found rooms that weren't on any blueprint, rooms with reinforced steel doors and walls lined with soundproofing. Tom Morrison wasn't just any farmer. He was a former FBI agent who'd moved his family here to escape his violent past. He recognized the signs immediately. This wasn't just a barn, it was a safe house. Someone had used their property to hide people, but the question that made his blood run cold was simple. Were they hiding victims or criminals? When Sarah discovered the underground tunnels connecting to 3 other properties in town, they realized their dream renovation had uncovered a network that powerful people would kill to keep secret. The Morrison family thought they were building a home, but they'd actually stumbled into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of their small community. But who was behind it? And why was their barn the center of it all? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Morrison property as Tom stood in what should have been their future kitchen, staring at the steel door that had no right to exist. His calloused hands traced the reinforced frame, muscle memory from his FBI days, making him check for booby traps and pressure plates. Clean, professional, military grade. "Tom?" Sarah's voice echoed from somewhere below ground, muffled by layers of concrete and earth. "You need to see this." He followed her voice through the hidden entrance they'd discovered beneath what appeared to be ordinary floorboards. The tunnel stretched into darkness, lined with the kind of ventilation system that cost serious money. Someone had invested heavily in this operation, whatever it was. Sarah waited for him 30 feet down, her contractor's flashlight illuminating a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 directions. Her face was pale in the artificial light, dirt smudged across her cheek where she'd been crawling through spaces meant to remain hidden. "The blueprints we got from the county show nothing about any of this," she said, gesturing at the sophisticated network surrounding them. "I followed the eastern tunnel for about 200 yards before I turned back. Tom, it leads directly toward the Hendricks property." Tom's jaw tightened. Mayor Richard Hendricks owned half the commercial real estate in their small town of Cedar Falls. A pillar of the community, served on the school board, donated generously to local charities. Also happened to live on the property that apparently connected to Tom's barn through a secret underground passage. "The other 2 tunnels?" he asked, though he was already dreading the answer. "Western one seems to head toward the old Carmichael place. Northern tunnel is the longest. I'm guessing it reaches the industrial district." Sarah wiped her hands on her jeans, leaving dark streaks. "Tom, what kind of operation needs this level of infrastructure? This isn't some weekend hobby. Somebody spent years building this network." Tom examined the tunnel walls more carefully. The construction was recent, maybe 5 to 10 years old. Fresh concrete, modern electrical systems running along the ceiling, even Ethernet cables suggesting internet connectivity. Whoever built this had resources and expertise. "We need to call the state police," Sarah said quietly. "No." The word came out sharper than Tom intended. "Not yet." "What do you mean, not yet?" "Tom, we've stumbled onto something illegal, something dangerous. Our kids play in the yard directly above this tunnel system. They're children. 8-year-old Emma and 12-year-old Jake, who were currently at Sarah's mother's house in Omaha while their parents worked on the renovation. Thank God for small mercies. If we call the authorities now, we lose control of this situation," Tom explained, his training overriding his panic. "We don't know who's involved, how high this goes, or what kind of resources they have. For all we know, half the sheriff's department could be on their payroll." Sarah stared at him. "You think this goes that deep?" I think someone very smart and very careful has been using our property as the center of an operation that requires the kind of security I used to see protecting federal witnesses. The question is whether we're looking at a protection network or something much darker. A distant sound made them both freeze. Footsteps, coming from the northern tunnel. Tom grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her toward the entrance shaft. Move, now. They scrambled up through the hidden access point, Tom replacing the floorboards just as the front door of their barn creaked open above them. Through the gaps in the old wood, he could see boots, expensive boots that had never worked a day on any farm. "Hello?" a familiar voice called out. "Mayor Hendricks. Tom? Sarah? Your truck's outside. Hope you don't mind me stopping by to see how the renovation's coming along." Tom met Sarah's terrified eyes in the dim light filtering through the floorboards. Their neighbor hadn't come to chat about home improvement. He'd come because someone had noticed their discovery. The game had already begun, and the Morrison family didn't even know the rules yet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn floor as Sarah Morrison pushed open the heavy wooden doors. Dust motes danced in the golden light, and the familiar smell of aged wood and hay filled her nostrils. She'd always loved this barn, even before they'd bought the property 3 years ago. There was something timeless about it, something that spoke to her of simpler days and honest work. Her husband Mike was already inside, measuring tape in hand, sketching rough dimensions on a yellow legal pad. Their 16-year-old daughter Emma sat cross-legged on a hay bale, scrolling through her phone with the practiced indifference of a teenager forced into family labor. "So the contractor thinks we can definitely convert this into a proper workshop," Mike said, not looking up from his measurements. "Maybe even add a small apartment upstairs for when your mother visits." Sarah winced at the mention of her mother but said nothing. The renovation had been Mike's idea, a way to add value to their property and give him the woodworking space he'd always wanted. The insurance settlement from his accident had finally made it possible. "Dad, this place is creepy," Emma announced, wrinkling her nose. "It smells like dead things." "That's just old wood, sweetheart. Once we clean it up and get some proper ventilation in here, it'll be perfect." Mike's enthusiasm was infectious, even if Emma remained unconvinced. Sarah walked deeper into the barn, running her hand along the rough-hewn support beams. The craftsmanship was remarkable for something built in the 1890s. Whoever had constructed this barn had built it to last. She paused at the far wall where several boards seemed darker than the others, as if they'd been replaced at some point. "Mike, come look at this." He joined her, squinting at the wall in the dim light. "Huh, that's odd. These boards are definitely newer than the rest." Sarah pressed her palm against the mismatched wood. It felt different somehow, less solid than the surrounding structure. "Do you think there was damage at some point? Maybe a hole that needed patching?" "Could be." The real estate agent did mention the barn had been used for storage by the previous owners for decades. Maybe they modified it somehow. Emma had wandered over, suddenly interested now that something mysterious was involved. "What if there's treasure back there, like in those ghost hunter shows?" Mike chuckled. "I don't think we're going to find buried pirate gold, Em, but we should probably see what's behind here before we start any major work." He tapped the wall with his knuckles, producing a hollow sound that made all three of them exchange glances. "Definitely something back there," Sarah said, pressing her ear to the wood. "It echoes." Mike disappeared to his truck and returned with a crowbar and flashlight. "Stand back, ladies. Let's see what we're dealing with." He worked the crowbar into the gap between two of the newer boards, applying steady pressure until the nails began to give way with sharp, protesting squeaks. The first board came loose with a sudden crack that made Emma jump. Cool air rushed out from the opening, carrying with it a musty smell that was distinctly different from the rest of the barn. It was earthier, damper, tinged with something Sarah couldn't quite identify, but that made her stomach tighten with unease. Mike shone his flashlight through the gap. "Well, I'll be damned. There's definitely a room back here." He pried off 2 more boards, creating an opening large enough to squeeze through. The flashlight beam revealed a small, windowless space that extended back into darkness. "I'm not going in there," Emma said flatly. "That's like the beginning of every horror movie ever made." Sarah felt the same instinctive reluctance, but curiosity won out. "Let me see the flashlight." She aimed the beam into the hidden room, following the walls from left to right. The space was roughly 8 feet wide and seemed to extend back at least 10 feet. The walls were unfinished stone, probably fieldstone from the property itself. But what caught her attention were the objects scattered on the dirt floor. "There are things in here," she said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "What kind of things?" Mike asked, crowding closer to peer over her shoulder. Sarah adjusted the angle of the light. Metal objects caught the beam, reflecting it back in brief, sharp glints. There were wooden items too, and what looked like fabric, though anything made of cloth had long since deteriorated into unrecognizable rags. "I think we need to call someone," she said, stepping back from the opening. "The Historical Society, maybe? This could be significant." Mike was already pulling more boards loose, his excitement overriding any caution. "Come on, Sarah. Aren't you curious? This is our property. Whatever's in there has been waiting over a century for someone to find it." That was exactly what worried her. The morning sun cast long shadows across the barn floor as Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway, coffee mug in hand, staring at the gaping hole her husband had discovered the night before. What had seemed like a trick of imagination in the dim evening light now appeared undeniably real in the harsh clarity of day. "Mom, what's that?" Emma's voice made Sarah jump, nearly spilling her coffee. Her 16-year-old daughter had inherited her father's curiosity and her mother's stubborn streak, a dangerous combination. "Just some old storage space Dad found," Sarah said, attempting to keep her voice casual. "Probably used for root vegetables or something." Emma pushed past her mother, phone flashlight already activated. "This is so cool. It's like a secret room." She knelt at the edge of the opening, directing the light downward. "There's definitely a floor down there, and it looks like it goes back pretty far." "Emma, get away from there." Sarah's maternal instincts kicked in, but her daughter was already lowering herself through the opening. "It's not that deep. Maybe 6 feet." Emma's voice echoed strangely from below. "Mom, you have to see this. There's a whole room down here." Against her better judgment, Sarah found herself following her daughter into the hidden space. The air below was stale and cold, carrying an odd metallic smell that made her nose wrinkle. Her phone's flashlight revealed a rectangular room about 12 feet by 8 feet, with rough stone walls and a packed earth floor. "Look at this," Emma whispered, her voice filled with excitement and something else, something that made Sarah's skin crawl. Along one wall, metal rings had been driven into the stone. They were old, heavily rusted, but the purpose they once served was unmistakable. Sarah's mouth went dry. "We need to get out of here. Now." "But, Mom." "Now, Emma." They climbed out in silence, but Sarah could see the wheels turning in her daughter's mind. Emma wasn't the type to let mysteries go unsolved, and this discovery would consume her thoughts until she had answers. 20 minutes later, David's truck pulled into the driveway. Sarah met him at the kitchen door, her face pale. "You went down there," he said. It wasn't a question. Emma found it. "She went down before I could stop her." Sarah wrapped her arms around herself. "David, those metal rings in the wall." "I know." His voice was grim. "I've been thinking about them all morning. I called the County Historical Society. They're sending someone out this afternoon. What do you think we're dealing with here?" David was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window toward the barn. "I've been researching our property's history online. The previous owners, the Henley family, owned this place for over 70 years before we bought it. But before that..." He pulled out his phone, showing Sarah a grainy black-and-white photograph. The original owner was a man named Silas Crane. He bought the land in 1923. Sarah studied the photograph. Crane was a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a severe expression. Something about his face made her uncomfortable, though she couldn't pinpoint why. What happened to him? That's the interesting part. He disappeared in 1934, just vanished one night, leaving everything behind. The property sat empty for almost a decade before the Henleys bought it at auction. Emma appeared in the kitchen doorway, having obviously been eavesdropping. What if he was hiding something down there? What if that's why he disappeared? "Emma," Sarah began. "No, think about it. A secret room with chains or whatever those metal things are. A guy who mysteriously vanishes. This is like something out of a crime documentary." David and Sarah exchanged glances. Their daughter's enthusiasm for the macabre was troubling, but her logic wasn't entirely wrong. "We'll let the Historical Society expert examine the room," David said firmly. "Until then, I don't want anyone going down there. It could be structurally unsound." "But Dad—" "No arguments, Em. I'm serious about this." The rest of the morning passed slowly. Sarah found herself repeatedly glancing toward the barn, unable to shake the feeling that they had disturbed something that should have remained buried. The metallic smell seemed to linger in her nostrils, and she caught herself washing her hands obsessively, trying to scrub away a feeling of contamination that was entirely psychological. At 2 o'clock, a sedan pulled into their driveway. A middle-aged woman with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses emerged, carrying a leather satchel and a powerful flashlight. Dr. Patricia Webb. She introduced herself with a firm handshake. "I understand you've made an interesting discovery." As they walked toward the barn, Dr. Webb peppered them with questions about the property's history and the circumstances of their find. Her professional demeanor was reassuring until they reached the opening in the barn floor. The moment Dr. Webb shone her flashlight into the hidden room, her expression changed completely. The color drained from her face, and she took an involuntary step backward. "Dear God," she whispered, "I need to make some phone calls." The silence stretched between them as Sarah stared at the photograph, her hands trembling slightly. The woman's face seemed to bore into her soul, those dark eyes holding secrets that had been buried for decades. Tom moved closer, studying the image over her shoulder. "Look at the date," he whispered, pointing to the faded inscription on the back. "August 1952. Sarah turned the photograph over. In spidery handwriting, someone had written, "Margaret Whitmore, she knew too much." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The cryptic message felt like a warning echoing across time. She set the photograph aside and reached for another item from the box, a leather-bound journal with a brass clasp. The leather was cracked and worn, but surprisingly well-preserved given its age. Tom watched as she carefully opened the journal. The pages were filled with the same spidery handwriting from the photograph, but the ink had faded to a rusty brown that made Sarah's stomach turn. She realized with growing horror that it might not be ink at all. "September 3rd, 1952, she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "They think I don't know what happened to Margaret, but I saw them carry her body out that night. I saw what they did to her in that room below. God help me, I was too frightened to stop them." Tom's face went pale. "Below? What room below?" Sarah continued reading, her voice growing stronger despite her fear. "The others are getting suspicious. They know I've been asking questions. I've hidden this journal and the photograph where they'll never think to look. If something happens to me, maybe someday someone will find the truth." She flipped through more pages, most of them illegible due to water damage and time. But scattered entries painted a disturbing picture of fear, secrecy, and violence. Names appeared repeatedly. Harold Blackwood, Vincent Chase, the Morrison name among them. "My God," Tom breathed. "Your grandfather's name is all through this." Sarah's hands shook as she read another passage. "October 15th, 1952. Harold came to see me today. He knows I've been writing everything down. He threatened Emma and the children, said accidents happen to families who don't mind their own business. I'm going to stop writing now. I pray someone will understand what we found down there, what they were doing to those poor souls." The journal entries stopped abruptly after that date. Sarah turned the remaining pages, finding them blank except for one final entry, written in a different, more frantic hand. "They took Mary tonight. The screaming from below has stopped. I'm next. The key is behind the loose stone. Tell our children we loved them. Edmund Whitmore, October 20th, 1952. Sarah slammed the journal shut, her heart pounding. The silence of the barn felt oppressive now, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Tom stood up abruptly, running his hands through his hair. "We need to call the police," he said. "And tell them what? That we found a 70-year-old journal with mysterious entries?" Sarah shook her head. "They'll think we're crazy. Sarah, this is talking about murder. Multiple murders by the sound of it." She picked up another item from the box, a small brass key attached to a piece of twine. The metal was tarnished but solid, and something about its weight felt significant in her palm. "The key is behind the loose stone," she murmured, repeating Edmund Whitmore's final words. Tom knelt beside her again. "You don't seriously think that there's more to find? That whatever happened here isn't finished?" Sarah met his eyes. "Tom, my grandfather's name is in this journal. My family has owned this property for decades. If something terrible happened here, if people were murdered—" She didn't finish the thought, but they both understood. The implications were staggering. If the Morrisons had been involved in covering up murders, if bodies were buried somewhere on their property, their entire family legacy would be destroyed. A sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps on the barn's main floor, slow and deliberate. "Mom? Dad?" Jake's voice echoed down to them. "Are you guys down there?" Sarah quickly shoved the journal and photograph back into the box, her mind racing. How much should they tell the children? How much did they dare investigate on their own? "Coming, honey," she called back, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. As they climbed back up to the main level, Sarah clutched the brass key in her pocket. The weight of it seemed to grow heavier with each step, as if it were pulling her toward whatever secrets still lay hidden on their property. Jake stood near the barn doors, his expression curious. "What were you guys doing down there for so long?" Tom forced a smile. "Just checking out the foundation, making sure everything's solid before we continue the renovation." But Sarah knew that nothing felt solid anymore. Everything they thought they knew about their home, their family, their past, it was all shifting like sand beneath their feet. The photographs spread across the kitchen table like a puzzle of nightmares. Sarah's hands trembled as she picked up another image. A young woman, perhaps 20, with hollow eyes and rope burns visible around her wrists. The black and white photograph was dated 1923 on the back in faded pencil. "There are dozens of them," David whispered, his voice hoarse. They had been sorting through the contents of the metal box for 2 hours, and each new discovery made their stomachs turn. "Look at this." He held up a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. The handwriting inside was meticulous, documenting names, dates, and details that painted a horrifying picture. Sarah read over his shoulder, her breath catching as the implications became clear. Subject 7 arrived Tuesday, estimated age 19, blonde hair, blue eyes, resistant to initial conditioning. David's voice broke as he continued reading. Applied standard techniques. Subject became compliant after 72 hours. Emma sat in the corner of the kitchen, her face pale as she clutched her phone. "I've been researching the previous owners," she said quietly. "The Blackwood family owned this land from 1895 to 1954. Dr. Ezra Blackwood was some kind of physician, but I can't find much about his practice." Jake burst through the back door, having spent the morning exploring the hidden areas they'd discovered. "There's more," he announced, his excitement tinged with revulsion. "I found another room behind the first one. There are restraints bolted to the walls." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting waves of nausea. The beautiful property they'd fallen in love with, the place where they'd planned to build their new life, had been a chamber of horrors. The barn renovation that was supposed to be their fresh start had uncovered something that should have stayed buried forever. "We need to call the police," she said firmly. "This is evidence of crimes, terrible crimes." David shook his head, still poring over the journal entries. "These are almost a century old, Sarah. Everyone involved is long dead. What are the police going to do? They can investigate properly. Maybe there are families out there who never knew what happened to their daughters, their sisters." Sarah's voice rose with conviction. These women deserve justice, even if it's just their stories being told. Emma looked up from her phone, her face grim. I found something else. Dr. Ezra Blackwood disappeared in 1954, just vanished. The property was sold by the county for unpaid taxes, and no one ever saw him again. The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old grandfather clock. Jake sat down heavily at the table, picking up one of the photographs. What if he didn't just disappear? What if someone stopped him? What do you mean? David asked. Think about it. All these women going missing, and then suddenly he's gone too. Maybe someone figured out what he was doing. Maybe someone took justice into their own hands. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. You think he's buried somewhere on this property? Before anyone could answer, a loud crash echoed from the barn. They all froze, listening. The sound came again, deliberate, rhythmic banging, like someone striking wood with a hammer. David grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. Stay here, he commanded, but his family was already following him toward the door. They approached the barn cautiously, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the yard. The banging had stopped, leaving an eerie silence. David pushed open the barn door slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, everything appeared normal. The renovation supplies were where they'd left them, the tools neatly arranged, but something felt different, wrong. Look, Emma whispered, pointing toward the hidden entrance they'd discovered. The wooden panel that concealed the secret room had been moved. It now stood completely open, revealing the dark passage beyond. We left that closed, Jake said, his voice barely audible. David stepped forward, shining the flashlight into the hidden space. The beam illuminated the narrow corridor, but something was different. The floor was covered with fresh dirt, as if someone had been digging recently. Dad, Emma grabbed his arm. There's something else. I found newspaper clippings from 1954. 3 local men were found dead in the woods about 2 miles from here. The cause of death was listed as suspicious circumstances, but the case was never solved. Sarah felt the pieces clicking together in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. 3 men, dead right around the time Blackwood disappeared. What if they were the ones who stopped him? David said slowly. What if they found out about the women and confronted him? What if... A low moan echoed from within the hidden passage, cutting off his words. It was a sound of pain, of anguish, but also of warning. The Morrison family stood frozen at the threshold, realizing that whatever secrets their property held, they were far from finished with the living. The morning light filtering through the kitchen windows felt different somehow, as if the very air in the house had changed overnight. Sarah sat at the breakfast table, her coffee growing cold as she stared at the photographs spread before her. The faces of the missing children seemed to watch her, their innocent smiles a stark contrast to the horror of what she now knew. David emerged from his study, dark circles under his eyes betraying a sleepless night. He'd spent hours poring over the documents they'd found, trying to piece together a timeline that made sense. The local newspaper clippings dated back to 1987, when the first child had vanished. 8-year-old Timothy Chen, who'd been riding his bicycle near the Morrison property when he disappeared without a trace. I called the police, David said quietly, settling into the chair across from Sarah. Detective Reynolds is coming by this afternoon. Sarah nodded, though part of her wondered if involving the authorities was the right move. The documents they discovered painted a disturbing picture, but they were also undeniable evidence that something terrible had happened on their property, something their family had unknowingly inherited along with the deed. Emma appeared in the doorway, still in her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. Mom, why are there police cars outside? Sarah's heart sank as she looked through the window. 2 patrol cars sat in their driveway, along with an unmarked sedan that could only belong to a detective. They were early. Stay here with Jake, Sarah instructed Emma. Your father and I need to speak with some people. The lead detective was a woman in her 50s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue every detail of the barn as David led her inside. Detective Linda Reynolds had worked missing persons cases for over 2 decades, and her expression grew increasingly grim as she examined the hidden room. "How long have you lived here?" she asked, pulling on latex gloves before carefully handling the photographs. 3 years, Sarah replied. "We bought the property from the Hendricks family. They'd owned it since the 70s. Detective Reynolds paused at one particular photograph. "This is Marcus Hendricks," she said, pointing to a man in his 60s standing beside what appeared to be a much younger version of their barn. He was questioned multiple times over the years about the disappearances, but we never had enough evidence to pursue charges. David felt his stomach drop. "Are you saying the previous owner was a suspect?" "I'm saying Marcus Hendricks was a person of interest in several missing children cases spanning nearly 20 years, but he died in 2018, just months before he sold this property to you." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. They'd been living on the property of a suspected child killer. Their children had been playing in the same fields where unspeakable horrors might have occurred. Detective Reynolds continued her examination, taking photographs and carefully bagging evidence. When she reached the wooden chest, her expression darkened further. Inside, beneath the documents, she found items that made Sarah's blood run cold: a small red bicycle helmet, a child's wristwatch, and a faded purple hair ribbon. "We'll need to conduct a full forensic investigation of the property," Reynolds said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm going to have to ask you and your family to stay elsewhere for the next few days while we process the scene." As if summoned by her words, Jake burst through the barn doors, his face flushed with excitement. "Mom, Dad, you have to see what I found in the—" He stopped short when he saw the detective and the evidence bags. "Jake, go back to the house," David said quickly, but his son had already noticed the photographs scattered across the workbench. "Are those the missing kids from town?" Jake asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Tommy Chen's little brother is in my grade. He said his family never found out what happened to Tommy." Detective Reynolds knelt down to Jake's eye level. "Son, what were you about to show your parents?" Jake glanced nervously between his parents and the detective. "There's another room, under the house. I found it when I was looking for Mom's gardening gloves in the basement." Sarah felt the world tilt around her. Another room, another secret their property had been hiding. Within an hour, the Morrison house was swarming with investigators. Crime scene technicians photographed every inch of the hidden basement room Jake had discovered, while ground-penetrating radar equipment was unloaded from a specialized van. As Sarah packed overnight bags for her family, her hands trembling with each item she folded, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were only beginning to uncover the truth about their property. The children's faces from the photograph seemed burned into her memory, and she found herself wondering how many more secrets lay buried beneath the ground they'd called home. The worst part was the growing certainty that Marcus Hendricks hadn't worked alone. Someone else knew about the hidden rooms, the missing children, the terrible secrets of the Morrison property, and that someone was still alive. The flashlight beam trembled in Sarah's hand as she descended the narrow wooden steps, each creak echoing through the darkness below. Behind her, Tom's breathing was shallow, and she could feel his tension radiating through the cramped space. The hidden staircase they'd discovered behind the false wall seemed to spiral endlessly downward, far deeper than should have been possible given the barn's foundation. "This doesn't make sense," Tom whispered, his voice barely audible. "We should have hit ground level by now." Sarah paused, counting the steps they'd taken. 27, 28. The air grew colder with each descent, carrying a musty odor that seemed almost metallic. When her flashlight finally illuminated the bottom, she gasped. They stood in a circular chamber carved directly from the bedrock beneath their property. The walls were smooth stone, clearly shaped by human hands, and along the perimeter sat a series of wooden benches arranged in concentric circles. In the center of the room stood an ornate wooden podium, its surface stained dark with age. "Jesus Christ," Tom breathed, sweeping his own flashlight across the space. "What is this place?" Sarah moved toward the podium, her footsteps unnaturally loud in the confined space. As she drew closer, she noticed symbols carved into its surface, intricate patterns that seemed to writhe in the shifting light. At the base of the podium, something glinted. "Tom, look at this." She knelt and picked up a small metal object. It was a locket, tarnished silver with an engraved rose on its face. Inside, a photograph of a young woman with haunting eyes stared back at her. 1924, Tom read, examining the inscription on the back. "That's almost exactly when our property records begin. Before that, it's like this place didn't exist." Sarah pocketed the locket and continued exploring. Behind the podium, partially hidden in shadow, stood a wooden cabinet. Its doors hung slightly ajar, revealing rows of leather-bound journals. She pulled one out, its binding cracking as she opened it. The pages were filled with meticulous handwriting in faded brown ink. As she read, her blood ran cold. "The 13th gathering has concluded successfully. The Morrison girl proved most receptive to our teachings, though her resistance required additional persuasion. Brother Elias believes she will be ready for the final ceremony within the fortnight." Tom peered over her shoulder. "Morrison? That's impossible. We're the first Morrisons to own this land." Sarah flipped through more pages, finding entry after entry detailing something called the Order of the Crimson Dawn. The journal described rituals, ceremonies, and what appeared to be some form of indoctrination or coercion involving young women from the surrounding area. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a particular entry dated September 15th, 1924. "They mention someone named Catherine Morrison, says she was selected for the great purpose, and that her sacrifice would ensure the continuation of the sacred work." Tom's face had gone pale. "My grandfather never mentioned any relatives named Catherine, but if she was family..." A sound from above made them both freeze. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing the barn floor directly overhead. Sarah grabbed another journal and stuffed both into her jacket. "We need to get out of here." They moved quickly toward the stairs, but Tom caught her arm. "Wait, look at this." He was shining his light on the wall beside the staircase, where someone had scratched words into the stone with what appeared to be a nail or small blade. "They killed her. The truth is in the well, CM, 1924. The footsteps above had stopped, and now they could hear voices, multiple voices, speaking in low tones. "Sarah? Tom? We know you're down there." The voice belonged to Deputy Hendricks, but something in his tone sent chills down Sarah's spine. It wasn't the concerned, helpful tone he'd used during his earlier visits. This was different, commanding, almost predatory. "There's no other way out," Tom whispered frantically, scanning the chamber. But Sarah was studying the wall where Catherine Morrison's desperate message was carved. Running her hands along the stones, she found what she was looking for, a section that felt different, slightly recessed. "Help me push this," she hissed. Together they pressed against the wall, and with a grinding sound, a section swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel that disappeared into darkness. The sound of heavy boots on the wooden stairs echoed from above. "Go," Sarah urged, pushing Tom toward the opening. "I'll be right behind you." As they squeezed through the gap, Sarah caught a glimpse of flashlight beams cutting through the darkness of the chamber they'd just vacated. But more disturbing than the lights was what she'd seen in that final second, the silhouette of Deputy Hendricks descending the stairs, and behind him, at least 3 other figures. The tunnel was barely wide enough for them to crawl through single file, and somewhere in the distance, Sarah thought she could hear running water. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the faces looking back at her from across the decades. The black and white image showed a group of men in suits standing before what was unmistakably their barn, though it looked different, newer, with fresh paint and none of the weathering that time had brought. But it was the man in the center that made her blood run cold. "That's impossible," she whispered, sinking into the kitchen chair beside Tom, who was still hunched over the ledger they'd found in the hidden room. "Look at this." Tom glanced up from the meticulous entries of names, dates, and dollar amounts that filled the pages before him. His eyes widened as he focused on the central figure in the photograph. The man bore an unsettling resemblance to Tom himself, the same strong jawline, the same deep-set eyes, even the same way of standing with one shoulder slightly raised. "Who is he?" Sarah asked, though something in her gut already knew the answer would change everything. Tom carefully took the photograph, studying it under the kitchen light. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, E. Morrison and Associates, 1924. Below that, in different handwriting, the last delivery. "My great-grandfather," Tom said slowly. "Ezra Morrison. But my family always said he was a farmer, maybe did some carpentry work on the side." He set the photo down and turned to the ledger, his finger tracing the columns. "These aren't farming records, Sarah. Look at this. Chicago shipment, 200 cases, $5,000. And here, Detroit run, 150 cases, payment received." Sarah leaned over his shoulder, inhaling the musty smell of old paper and secrets. "What kind of cases? During Prohibition?" Tom's voice was grim. Only one kind of cases moved that kind of money. The implications settled over them like a suffocating blanket. Their property, their home, their children's inheritance, all of it built on a foundation of illegal liquor smuggling during the 1920s. The hidden room suddenly made perfect sense. The strange ventilation system, the separate entrance, the reinforced walls that had puzzled the contractors. "There's more," Tom said, flipping through pages. "Names I recognize. The Castellas, they still own that restaurant downtown. The Henrys from the next county over. And look at this." He pointed to a series of entries from late 1924. The payments stop abruptly in October. Every entry after that is just storage, no payment. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message. "Detective Martinez, I need to talk. Found something about your property's history. Are you home?" "The police are coming," Sarah said, showing Tom the message. "Should we tell them about this?" Before Tom could answer, a loud crash echoed from the barn, followed by Emma's scream. They bolted from their chairs, the photograph and ledger forgotten on the table as they raced across the yard. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows that seemed to reach toward them like grasping fingers. Inside the barn, they found Emma standing frozen near the entrance to the hidden room. Jake was beside her, his face pale as parchment. On the floor lay a wooden crate that had apparently fallen from a high shelf, its contents scattered across the rough boards. But these weren't the empty bottles they'd found before. These bottles were full, their contents still amber clear after nearly a century. The sweet, sharp smell of aged whiskey filled the air where the liquid had spilled from several broken bottles. "We were just looking," Emma stammered. "The box just fell and—" "Mom, Dad," Jake interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "There's someone watching us." All four heads turned toward the barn's main entrance, where a figure stood silhouetted against the fading daylight. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark coat despite the warm weather. His face was hidden in shadow, but there was something predatory in the way he stood perfectly still, observing them. "Can I help you?" Tom called out, stepping protectively in front of his family. His hand instinctively reached for the hammer he'd left on a nearby workbench. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a slow step into the barn, his footsteps echoing ominously in the cavernous space. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old authority and barely contained menace. "Name's Vincent Castelli," he said, his eyes moving from the spilled whiskey to the open entrance of the hidden room. "I think you've found something that belongs to my family." Sarah felt her knees go weak as recognition hit her. Castelli, the name from the ledger, the restaurant downtown, the family that had apparently been doing business with Tom's great-grandfather nearly 100 years ago. "I think," Vincent continued, stepping closer, "it's time we discussed the terms of your lease on this property. Terms that were established long before you were born, and debts that don't disappear just because time passes." The children moved closer to their parents as the stranger's words settled over them like a death sentence wrapped in velvet courtesy. The photographs scattered across the kitchen table told a story Sarah wished she'd never learned. Each black and white image revealed another piece of the horrifying puzzle that had been hidden beneath their property for decades. Thomas sat across from her, his face pale as he examined a particularly disturbing photograph of what appeared to be a makeshift operating room in the barn's hidden chambers. "We have to call the police," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. The children were upstairs, hopefully asleep, unaware that their dream home had become the center of a nightmare. Thomas shook his head slowly, his fingers trembling as he set down another photograph. "Look at the dates on these, Sarah. Look at the names written on the backs." He turned over several images, revealing neat handwriting that documented names, dates, and procedures that made Sarah's stomach turn. The dates spanned from 1952 to 1978, 26 years of systematic horror that had taken place in the very barn they'd been renovating. But it was the names that made Sarah's blood run cold. Not the victims' names, though those were heartbreaking enough, but the signatures at the bottom of each notation. Dr. Harold Brennan, Sheriff James Crawford, Mayor William Hutchinson. "These aren't just random killers," Thomas said, voicing what Sarah had already realized. "This was organized, official. Look at these medical notes, these procedures. Someone was conducting experiments." Sarah's hands shook as she picked up a leather-bound journal they'd found with the photographs. The entries were meticulous, clinical, describing procedures performed on unwilling subjects who had been labeled as undesirable elements and social deviants. Homeless individuals, runaway teenagers, anyone who wouldn't be immediately missed. The sound of gravel crunching in their driveway made them both freeze. Sarah quickly began gathering the photographs while Thomas moved to the window, carefully pulling back the curtain. "It's Sheriff Davidson's car," he whispered. Sarah's heart pounded. Davidson had seemed genuinely helpful when they'd first discovered the rooms, but now she wondered if his interest had been more than professional curiosity. Had he known what they might find? Was he connected to the conspiracy that had operated for decades? "Hide everything," Sarah hissed, stuffing the photographs and journal into a manila envelope. "Act normal." The knock on their door came moments later. 3 firm raps that seemed to echo through the house like gunshots. Thomas answered, forcing a smile that Sarah hoped looked more natural than it felt. "Evening, Sheriff. Kind of late for a house call, isn't it?" Davidson stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the kitchen with an intensity that made Sarah's skin crawl. "Just wanted to check in, see how you folks are doing after the excitement yesterday. Sometimes these old discoveries can be pretty unsettling." "We're fine," Sarah said quickly. "Just tired. It's been a long day." The sheriff's gaze lingered on the kitchen table where minutes earlier the photographs had been spread out. Sarah had managed to clear them away, but she noticed Davidson's eyes pause at a corner of the table where one photograph had left a slight impression on the wooden surface. "You know," Davidson said, settling into a chair uninvited, "I've been thinking about those rooms you found. Pretty unusual construction for a barn built in 1923. Makes me wonder if there might be more to discover down there." Thomas remained standing, his posture tense. "We haven't been back down since yesterday. Honestly, the whole thing has us a bit spooked." Smart to be cautious, Davidson nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Sometimes old places hold on to their secrets for good reason. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, if you know what I mean. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah felt the envelope containing the photographs burning like a brand against her side where she'd hidden it behind her back. "We understand completely," she said. "We're actually thinking of just sealing up those rooms entirely. Pretend we never found them." "Now that," Davidson said, standing slowly, "sounds like a wise decision. Very wise indeed." He moved toward the door, then paused. "You folks haven't mentioned your discovery to anyone else, have you? Neighbors, family, that sort of thing?" "No one," Thomas replied immediately. "We figured it was better to keep it quiet." Davidson nodded approvingly. "Good thinking." Small towns like ours, rumors have a way of getting out of hand, could cause unnecessary panic, bring in outside attention that nobody wants. After the sheriff left, Sarah and Thomas stood in their kitchen, not daring to speak until they were certain his car had disappeared down the road. The weight of what they'd discovered pressed down on them like a physical force. "He knows," Sarah finally whispered. Thomas nodded grimly, "which means we're in more danger than we thought." The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the faces from decades past. The similarity was undeniable. The man standing beside what appeared to be their barn bore an unmistakable resemblance to David. Same jawline, same deep-set eyes, even the same way of holding his shoulders. "David, you need to see this," she whispered, but her voice seemed to echo in the suddenly oppressive basement. Heavy footsteps creaked across the floorboards above them. David froze, his finger still tracing the names carved into the wall. They weren't alone. Emma grabbed her father's arm, her eyes wide with terror. The footsteps moved deliberately, as if someone was searching each room methodically. David pressed his finger to his lips and motioned toward the narrow staircase they'd descended. The footsteps stopped directly overhead. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she clutched the photograph and the bundle of letters they'd discovered. These documents held answers about David's family history, answers someone clearly didn't want them to find. A door slammed somewhere upstairs, followed by the sound of furniture being moved. Whoever was up there wasn't trying to hide their presence anymore. "The window," David mouthed, pointing to a small basement window, barely large enough for a person to crawl through. Decades of paint had sealed it shut, but it was their only option besides the stairs. He grabbed a rusty crowbar from a workbench and began prying at the window frame. The paint cracked and peeled, each scrape sounding thunderous in the confined space. More footsteps echoed above, accompanied by voices now. At least 2 people, maybe 3. "Find anything down there?" a gruff voice called out. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They knew about the basement. The window finally gave way with a grinding screech of old wood and metal. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and damp earth. David boosted Emma up first, helping her squeeze through the narrow opening into the darkness outside. "Run to the truck," he whispered as she disappeared into the night. "If we're not there in 2 minutes, drive to town and call the police." Sarah was next, struggling through the window with the documents pressed against her chest. As David started to follow, the basement door burst open above them. "Down here!" A flashlight beam swept across the basement walls, illuminating the carved names and the scattered evidence of their discovery. David hauled himself through the window just as boots thundered down the wooden stairs. They ran across the uneven ground behind the barn, stumbling over roots and holes in the darkness. The truck sat 50 yards away, Emma already behind the wheel with the engine running, but between them and escape, 2 dark figures emerged from the shadows near the house. "Stop right there, Morrison." The voice belonged to someone older, authoritative. A flashlight clicked on, blinding them momentarily. As their eyes adjusted, Sarah could make out a tall man in a dark coat, his face hidden in shadow. "You've found something that doesn't belong to you," the man continued. "Hand over the documents and we can discuss this civilly." David stepped protectively in front of Sarah. "Who are you? What do you want with my property?" A bitter laugh echoed in the darkness. "Your property? Boy, your family gave up any claim to this land 60 years ago when they made their deal with us." "What deal?" "I don't know what you're talking about. Your grandfather knew exactly what he was getting into when he took our money. Some debts pass from generation to generation, and now it's time to collect." Sarah's mind raced through the letters she'd read in the basement, references to payments, to keeping secrets, to protecting certain interests in town. David's grandfather had been involved in something far more complex and dangerous than they'd imagined. "The land development project," she said suddenly, pieces clicking together. "You need our property for something bigger. That's why you've been pressuring us to sell." The man stepped closer, his face becoming visible in the reflected light. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and cold eyes that seemed familiar somehow. "Clever woman. Yes, this property sits right in the middle of our plans, but it's not just about development. There are things buried here that need to stay buried. Things your grandfather helped us hide." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The hidden rooms, the carefully concealed basement, the sense that the barn had been designed to hide something. It all made horrifying sense. "What's buried here?" David demanded. "Evidence, bodies, secrets that could destroy some very powerful people if they ever came to light." The second figure raised something that glinted in the darkness, a gun. "Now, you're going to give us those documents, and then we're going to have a long conversation about your family's obligations, starting with why you couldn't just take our generous offer and walk away." The metallic taste of fear lingered in Sarah's mouth as she crouched behind the old tractor, watching shadows move past the barn windows. 3 figures circled the building like predators, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness. She pressed her phone closer to her ear, whispering urgently to the 911 dispatcher. "They're armed," she breathed. "My family is trapped inside." Inside the barn, David pulled Emma and Jake deeper into the hidden room they'd discovered weeks ago. The space that had once horrified them now offered their only sanctuary. Emma clutched the journal they'd found, its pages containing testimonies from victims of the trafficking ring that had operated on their property decades earlier. "Dad, what if they find us?" Jake's voice trembled in the darkness. David's hand tightened on the crowbar he'd grabbed from his toolbox. "They won't. Your mother will get help." But even as he spoke, footsteps echoed above them. The intruders had entered the barn. "Check every inch," a gravelly voice commanded. "The old man said they found documents. We can't let this surface." Emma's breath hitched. The old man. They could only mean Harold Brennan, the former property owner who'd seemed so helpful during the sale. She remembered his insistence on handling the paperwork personally, his nervous energy when they'd mentioned renovating the barn. Now it all made terrifying sense. Outside, Sarah watched helplessly as a 4th figure emerged from a black SUV parked behind the tree line. Her heart sank as she recognized the silhouette, Sheriff Morrison, David's own brother. The man they'd trusted, the one they'd called first when strange things started happening. The family protector who'd been feeding information to the very people they were running from. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, "Come out now or your family dies." Sheriff Morrison stepped into view, his uniform catching the moonlight. Sarah's world tilted on its axis. The person meant to protect them had been orchestrating their destruction all along. Every detail they'd shared, every discovery they'd reported, he'd passed it all along to maintain the cover-up that had lasted for generations. Inside the hidden room, David heard the barn door creak open wider. Heavy boots moved across the wooden floor above, accompanied by the sound of equipment being overturned. They were conducting a systematic search, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the concealed entrance. Emma flipped frantically through the journal's pages, searching for anything that might help them. Her finger stopped on an entry dated 30 years ago, written in a child's handwriting. "Sheriff Morrison brought new kids today. He told Papa they'd be good workers. They look so scared." The horrible truth crystallized. This wasn't just about covering up past crimes. The corruption ran through generations, a family legacy of turning blind eyes and taking payments to ensure silence. David's own brother had inherited more than just a badge. He'd inherited a role in an ongoing conspiracy. Found something, called a voice from above. Footsteps approached the area directly over their hiding spot. David positioned himself between his children and the hidden door, raising the crowbar. If they were discovered, he'd buy Emma and Jake whatever time he could. Outside, Sarah made her decision. She couldn't wait for backup that might never come, not when her family's lives hung in the balance. She crept toward the SUV, hoping to disable it and trap the intruders on foot until real help arrived. But as she approached the vehicle, her brother-in-law's voice stopped her cold. I know you're out there, Sarah. Your husband's always been too curious for his own good, and apparently that runs in the family. She froze, realizing he'd been tracking her movements. The sheriff who'd taught her kids to fish, who'd attended every family barbecue, who'd walked her down the aisle when her father couldn't. This same man was now hunting them like animals. The property has secrets that need to stay buried, Morrison continued, his voice carrying across the yard. Secrets that keep this whole county running smoothly. Your family stumbled into something bigger than you understand. In the hidden room, Emma found another entry that made her blood run cold. It described a network of properties, all connected, all serving the same purpose. Their barn hadn't been an isolated location. It had been part of a trafficking route that spanned the entire region, protected by corrupt officials and maintained through fear and violence. "We have to tell someone," she whispered to her father. "First, we have to survive," David replied, hearing footsteps stop directly overhead. A thin beam of light suddenly pierced through a crack in their hiding spot's ceiling. They'd been found. The sound of splintering wood filled the air as someone began prying at the floorboards above. David gripped the crowbar tighter, knowing that in moments their sanctuary would become their trap. Outside, Sarah heard her family's screams pierce the night air, and she abandoned all caution, running toward the barn as the dispatcher's voice crackled uselessly through her phone's speaker. The headlights cut through the darkness as Sarah's car pulled into the gravel driveway, her heart hammering against her ribs. The familiar silhouette of their renovated barn loomed against the star-scattered sky, but nothing felt familiar anymore. Everything had changed since she'd left for the county courthouse that morning, armed with nothing but Eleanor Whitmore's cryptic journal entries and a desperate need for answers. What she'd found in the dusty archives had shattered every assumption about their property, their renovation, and the gruesome discovery that had started it all. The house was dark except for a single light burning in David's study. Sarah sat in the car for a moment, staring at that warm yellow glow, wondering how to tell her husband that their dream home was built on a foundation of calculated murder and decades-old conspiracy. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Marcus Webb, the investigative journalist who'd become their unlikely ally. "Found something else. We need to meet. Tomorrow morning, Old Miller Place on Route 9. She deleted the message and stepped out into the cool night air. The motion sensor light flickered on, casting harsh shadows across the yard. As she walked toward the house, movement in her peripheral vision made her freeze. Someone was watching from the tree line at the edge of their property. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The figure was too distant to make out clearly, but she could feel eyes boring into her. She fumbled for her keys, forcing herself to walk normally toward the front door, every instinct screaming at her to run. The deadbolt clicked open with trembling fingers, and she slipped inside, immediately throwing the security chain. "David?" Her voice echoed through the hallway. "In here." His response came from the study, but something in his tone made her pause. It was flat, carefully controlled. Sarah found him sitting behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Chief Patterson occupied the leather armchair across from him, his bulk making the furniture look almost delicate. Both men looked up as she entered, and the tension in the room was thick enough to cut. "Mrs. Morrison." Patterson's greeting was polite but cold. "We were just discussing your activities today." "My activities?" Sarah's mouth went dry. The manila folder containing photocopied documents from the courthouse felt like it was burning through her purse. David's eyes met hers, and she saw fear there. "Chief Patterson says there have been some concerns about us interfering with an ongoing investigation." "What investigation?" Sarah set her purse down carefully, mind racing. The case was closed. "You said so yourself." Patterson's smile was thin and predatory. "Cases can be reopened when new evidence comes to light, or when civilians start digging where they shouldn't." He shifted forward in his chair. "You've been asking a lot of questions at the courthouse today. Questions about property records, historical documents. Some folks are wondering why." The blood drained from Sarah's face. They'd been watching her, tracking her movements. "It's our property. We have every right to research its history. Of course you do. Patterson stood, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. But when that research starts interfering with matters of public safety, well, that's when it becomes my concern. David rose too, positioning himself slightly between Sarah and the police chief. What exactly are you saying, Chief? I'm saying that some secrets are buried for good reason. Sometimes digging them up does more harm than good. Patterson's gaze fixed on Sarah. Sometimes it can be downright dangerous for the people doing the digging. The threat was clear, hanging in the air like smoke. Sarah thought about the figure she'd seen at the tree line, about Marcus Webb's urgent text messages, about the horrifying truth she'd uncovered in those courthouse records. The Whitmore family hadn't been random victims of violence. They'd been silenced because they'd discovered something about the Morrison property's previous owner, something that certain people would still kill to keep hidden. I think you should leave. David's voice was steady, but Sarah could see the tension coiled in his shoulders. Patterson nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this response. I'll be going, but I want you both to think carefully about your next moves. This town has a way of protecting itself, and families that cooperate tend to find life much more peaceful than those that don't. He moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Mrs. Morrison? I'd be careful about who you trust. Not everyone offering to help has your best interests at heart. The front door closed with a soft click, and they listened to his footsteps crunching across the gravel. David immediately went to the window, watching until the patrol car's taillights disappeared down the road. Sarah, what the hell did you find today? She opened her purse with shaking hands and pulled out the folder. Something that explains everything, and something that means we're in more danger than we ever imagined. Outside, hidden in the darkness beyond the motion sensor's reach, two figures watched the house and waited for their next orders. The floorboards groaned under Sarah's weight as she crept through the darkness of the main house, her phone clutched tightly in her trembling hand. Every shadow seemed to move, every creak of the old structure made her heart race faster. She'd been trying to reach Detective Martinez for 20 minutes, but the call kept dropping to voicemail. The cell tower nearest their property had been experiencing outages all evening, according to the automated message. Behind her, Tom's footsteps echoed as he secured the last of the windows, sliding the heavy wooden boards they'd found in the basement across the frames. The irony wasn't lost on her, that they were barricading themselves inside the same house where so many had suffered and died decades ago. "Mom, where's Emma?" Jake's voice carried from the kitchen, tinged with the kind of panic that made Sarah's stomach drop. She rushed toward the sound, Tom close behind. They found Jake standing by the back door, which hung open, letting in the cold night air. Sarah's blood turned to ice. "She was right here," Jake said, his voice cracking. "She said she heard something outside, like crying. I told her not to go, but she just—" Tom was already grabbing his jacket and the heavy flashlight from the kitchen counter. "Which direction?" "Toward the woods, I think. Maybe the old well." Jake's face had gone pale in the kitchen light. "Dad, what if they got her? What if the people who killed Mr. Henderson—" "Don't." Sarah's voice was sharper than she intended. She couldn't let herself think about that possibility. "We'll find her. She probably just got turned around in the dark." But even as she said it, she knew Emma wasn't the type to wander off aimlessly. Their daughter was practical, cautious. If she'd gone outside alone, she had a reason. Tom was already at the door, but Sarah grabbed his arm. "We can't all go. Someone needs to stay with Jake, and someone needs to keep trying to reach the police. I'm not leaving you to search for Emma alone, and I'm not leaving our son unprotected." She could see the conflict in his eyes, the impossible choice between protecting one child and finding the other. "Tom, listen to me. You know these woods better than I do. You'll move faster alone, and if something happens to both of us out there—" Jake stepped forward. "I'm coming too." "Absolutely not." Both parents spoke in unison. "She's my sister," Jake protested, "and I'm the one who let her go." Sarah cupped her son's face in her hands. "This isn't your fault. Emma makes her own choices, you know that. But right now, I need you to be safe so we can focus on finding her." Tom handed Sarah the landline phone they'd connected that afternoon. "Keep trying the police. If you can't get through to Martinez, call 911. Tell them we have a missing child and potential intruders on the property." He paused at the threshold. "Lock this door behind me. Don't open it for anyone except Emma or me. You hear anything suspicious, anything at all, take Jake upstairs and barricade yourselves in the master bedroom." The moment the door closed behind him, Sarah turned the deadbolt and dragged the kitchen table in front of it for good measure. Through the window, she watched Tom's flashlight beam disappear into the tree line. "Mom," Jake's voice was small. "What if Emma found something else? What if there are more rooms we didn't know about?" The thought had occurred to Sarah too. The barn had revealed its secrets reluctantly, and who knew what other horrors might be hidden on their property? The previous owners had clearly gone to great lengths to conceal the truth. The Hendersons had lived here for 15 years without discovering what lay beneath their feet. She dialed Detective Martinez again, pacing the kitchen while listening to the endless ringing. On the 7th ring, the call connected, but the line was filled with static. "Martinez here. Can barely. You're breaking up." "Detective, it's Sarah Morrison. Our daughter is missing and we think—" The line went dead. She tried again immediately, but now she couldn't even get a dial tone. Jake was watching her with wide eyes. "The phones are down too?" Before Sarah could answer, they heard it, a sound that made them both freeze. It was faint but unmistakable, Emma's voice calling for help. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from beneath them. Jake grabbed Sarah's arm. "Mom, that's impossible. We searched the whole basement. There's nothing down there except—" They looked at each other, understanding dawning simultaneously. The basement they'd searched was directly under the kitchen and living room, but the house was larger than that. There were rooms they'd never thought to check for corresponding spaces below. Emma's voice came again, muffled and distant, but definitely from somewhere under the dining room floor. The sound of gravel crunching under tires made Sarah's blood freeze. She peered through the barn's dusty window, watching an unfamiliar black sedan pull into their driveway. 3 men in dark suits emerged, their movements deliberate and coordinated. "Michael," she whispered urgently into her phone. "They're here. Get Emma and get out. Now." His voice was tight with fear. "Use the back trail through the woods. I'm calling Sheriff Martinez." Sarah's hands trembled as she ended the call. The documents they'd found in the hidden room were still spread across the workbench. Photographs of missing women, financial records, correspondence that painted a picture of systematic murder spanning decades. The Morrison property hadn't just been a way station for human trafficking, it had been a killing ground. She stuffed the most damning evidence into a canvas bag and sprinted toward the house. Emma was in her room, headphones on, oblivious to the danger approaching their front door. "Emma!" Sarah burst through the bedroom door. "We have to go, right now." "Mom, what's—" "No questions. Move." Sarah grabbed Emma's jacket and pulled her daughter toward the back of the house. Through the kitchen window, she could see the men approaching the front porch, their faces cold and professional. They slipped out the back door just as the doorbell rang. Sarah's heart hammered as she guided Emma toward the tree line, praying the men wouldn't circle around the house immediately. The canvas bag felt impossibly heavy, weighted with secrets that had already cost too many lives. The woods behind their property were thick with underbrush and fallen logs. Sarah had hiked these trails countless times, but never while running for her life. Emma stumbled, her face pale with confusion and terror. "Mom, please tell me what's happening." "The people who used our property before us, they were dangerous, very dangerous. And some of their associates don't want that information getting out." Sarah helped Emma over a fallen tree. "Your father found connections to several missing persons cases. We have evidence that could expose a network that's been operating for 30 years. Behind them, she heard voices calling their names, deceptively friendly. The men had discovered they weren't in the house. They pressed deeper into the woods, following a deer trail that led toward the old mining road. Sarah's phone buzzed. A text from Michael, sheriff detained. "Don't trust local police. Going to state authorities." Her stomach dropped. If Sheriff Martinez was compromised, how deep did this corruption run? How many people in their small town had known about the horrors happening on the Morrison property and chosen to look the other way? A branch snapped somewhere behind them. The men were following, and they weren't trying to hide their pursuit anymore. "Can you run?" Sarah asked Emma. "I think so." They abandoned stealth for speed, crashing through the undergrowth as voices echoed behind them. Sarah's lungs burned, but terror drove her forward. The mining road was still half a mile away, and even then they'd need somewhere to hide until help arrived. Emma stumbled again, this time crying out as she fell. Her ankle was twisted, already beginning to swell. "I can't," she gasped. "Mom, I can't run anymore." Sarah looked back toward the sounds of pursuit, then at her daughter's injured ankle. They needed a place to hide, and they needed it now. "There's an old hunting blind about 200 yards north," she said, remembering the camouflaged shelter they'd discovered during a family hike last summer. "Can you make it that far if I help you?" Emma nodded, tears streaming down her face. They moved as quickly and quietly as possible, Emma leaning heavily on her mother's shoulder. The hunting blind was exactly where Sarah remembered, a small wooden structure built into a cluster of thick pines, invisible unless you knew where to look. Inside, the air was stale and musty. Sarah helped Emma settle against the back wall, then peered through one of the narrow viewing slots. She could see flashlight beams moving through the trees, getting closer. Her phone had one bar of signal. With shaking fingers, she typed a message to Michael, hiding in woods. "Emma hurt, men searching, evidence safe." The response came immediately. "State police en route. FBI contacted. Hold position." One of the flashlight beams swept past their hiding spot. Sarah held her breath, clutching the canvas bag to her chest. Inside were photographs of women whose families had never learned what happened to them, financial records showing payments to local officials, and correspondence that would finally expose the truth about decades of murder and corruption. "I know you're out here, Mrs. Morrison." The voice was calm, almost conversational. "We just want to talk. We can work something out, something that benefits everyone." Emma gripped her mother's hand, her eyes wide with terror. Sarah closed her eyes and prayed that help would arrive before they were found. The headlights cut through the darkness as Sarah pulled into their driveway, her hands still trembling on the steering wheel. The barn loomed before them, its familiar silhouette now transformed into something sinister in the moonlight. Marcus sat beside her in tense silence, while Emma and Tyler remained quiet in the back seat, sensing the gravity of their situation without fully understanding it. "We pack quickly," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Only essentials. We leave in 20 minutes. Sarah nodded, though her gaze remained fixed on the barn. Somewhere beneath that structure lay the evidence of horrors that had played out decades ago, and now those same dark forces had awakened to threaten her family. Sheriff Coleman's words echoed in her mind. You've stirred up something that was meant to stay buried." They moved through the house like ghosts, gathering clothes and necessities while trying to maintain an air of normalcy for the children. Sarah stuffed photo albums and important documents into a duffel bag, her movements mechanical. This house, which had represented a fresh start for their family, now felt like a trap waiting to spring shut. Marcus emerged from their bedroom carrying 2 suitcases. "I called my brother. We can stay at his place in Portland until we figure this out." "Figure what out?" Emma's voice startled them both. She stood in the doorway, her young face creased with worry. "Why are we leaving? What's happening?" Sarah knelt down to her daughter's eye level, struggling to find words that would explain without terrifying. "We just need to go away for a little while, sweetheart. There are some problems here that grown-ups need to handle." "Is it because of the rooms in the barn?" Tyler appeared beside his sister, his backpack slung over his shoulder. "The ones with all the old stuff?" Marcus and Sarah exchanged glances. Their son's intuition had always been sharp, perhaps too sharp for his own good. "Something like that," Marcus said carefully. "But it's not your fault, and you don't need to worry about it. We just need to be somewhere else right now." A sound from outside made them all freeze, the soft crunch of footsteps on gravel, slow and deliberate. Marcus moved to the window, peering through the curtains into the darkness beyond their porch light's reach. "I don't see anyone," he whispered, but his hand instinctively reached for the baseball bat they kept by the front door. Sarah herded the children away from the windows. "Kids, go to Tyler's room and stay there until we come get you. Don't come out no matter what you hear." "Mom, you're scaring me." Emma's voice wavered. "I know, baby. Just do what I say, okay? We'll be right there." The children disappeared upstairs, and Sarah could hear their hushed voices through the ceiling. Marcus remained at the window, bat in hand, while she grabbed her phone to call Sheriff Coleman. The call went straight to voicemail. "Marcus," she whispered urgently, "we need to go. Now." Another sound from outside, this time from the direction of the barn. A low metallic grinding, as if someone was opening the heavy door they'd installed over the entrance to the hidden chambers. "They're here," Marcus breathed. "Whoever they are, they're here." Sarah's mind raced through their options. The car was in the driveway, but they'd have to cross open ground to reach it. The back door led to the woods, but in darkness with two children, that route seemed equally dangerous. The grinding sound stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that felt heavier than the noise had been. "Get the kids," Marcus said. "We go out the back, through the woods to the Hendersons' place. They can call for help." Sarah nodded and started toward the stairs, but froze when she heard Tyler's voice from above. "Mom, there's someone outside my window." Her blood turned to ice. Tyler's room faced the backyard. If someone was positioned there, their escape route was cut off. Marcus was already moving, taking the stairs two at a time with the bat raised. Sarah followed, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. They found both children pressed against Tyler's far wall, staring at the window where a dark figure stood silhouetted against the glass. The person wasn't moving, just watching, waiting. "The guest room," Sarah whispered. "We can get onto the roof from there." They moved as quietly as possible down the hallway, Sarah carrying Emma while Marcus guided Tyler. Behind them, they heard the soft sound of Tyler's window sliding open. The guest room faced the front yard, giving them a view of their car and the barn beyond. 3 more figures stood motionless in the driveway, blocking any escape by vehicle. Marcus pushed open the window that led to the roof over their front porch, one at a time. "I'll go first, then the kids, then you." As he swung his leg over the windowsill, Sarah caught a glimpse of something that made her stomach drop. One of the figures in the driveway had raised something to their shoulder, something that gleamed dully in the moonlight. "Marcus, get down!" The sound of gravel crunching under tires made Sarah's blood freeze. Through the kitchen window, she watched a black sedan pull into their driveway, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. 3 days had passed since they'd escaped from the barn. 3 days of sleepless nights and constant vigilance, and now their worst fears were materializing before their eyes. "Tom," she whispered urgently, not daring to raise her voice. "They're here." Her husband appeared in the doorway, his face pale but determined. Over the past 72 hours, he'd aged what looked like years, the weight of their discovery etched in the deep lines around his eyes. Behind him, Emma clutched her younger brother's hand, both children having been instructed to stay away from all windows. "Take the kids to the root cellar," Tom said quietly. "Use the back stairs." Sarah nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. They'd prepared for this moment, knowing that their desperate call to the FBI field office in Portland might not be enough to protect them. The conspiracy they'd uncovered ran deeper than they'd initially imagined, with tentacles reaching into local law enforcement and beyond. The sedan's doors opened simultaneously, and 3 figures emerged. Even from a distance, Sarah could see they weren't law enforcement. Their movements were too coordinated, too predatory. These were the same people who had orchestrated decades of disappearances, who had used the Morrison property as their hunting ground and who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. "Mom?" Emma's voice was barely audible, but the terror in it cut through Sarah like a blade. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart," Sarah lied, guiding her children toward the narrow staircase that led to the old root cellar beneath the kitchen. Tom had spent the previous day clearing it out and stocking it with supplies, just in case. Remember what we practiced? The cellar was cramped and musty, carved from the earth when the house was built over a century ago. Sarah settled the children in the far corner, behind shelves lined with dusty mason jars, and pressed her finger to her lips. Above them, footsteps echoed across the front porch. Tom's voice carried down through the floorboards, artificially calm as he answered the door. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" "Mr. Morrison." The responding voice was smooth, educated, completely at odds with what Sarah knew these people were capable of. "I think you know why we're here. You've discovered something that doesn't belong to you. I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." A different voice laughed, cold and humorless. "Let's not play games. The room under your barn, the documents, the photographs. You've seen too much." Sarah pressed her children closer, feeling Emma's silent tears against her shoulder. Through the gaps in the floorboards, she could see shadows moving across the kitchen floor above them. More people had entered the house. "Where's your family, Tom?" The first voice again, patient but threatening. "It'll be easier for everyone if we handle this quickly." "They're not here." Tom's voice remained steady, but Sarah could hear the strain beneath it. "My wife took the kids to her mother's house in Augusta." Interesting, because our colleague at the phone company shows several calls made from this number to local businesses just this morning. Grocery store, hardware store, not the kind of calls someone makes from 2 hours away. The footsteps above them spread out, clearly searching. Sarah heard drawers being opened, furniture moved, her phone buzzed silently in her pocket, a text from her contact at the FBI. The message was only 2 words, but they hit her like a physical blow. Compromised. Run. A door slammed somewhere upstairs, followed by heavy footsteps on the upper floor. They were conducting a systematic search, and it was only a matter of time before someone thought to check the cellar. Sarah looked around desperately, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through a small window well near the ceiling. The window. It was small, but possibly large enough for the children. She leaned close to Emma's ear. "The window," she breathed. "Take Jake, run to the Hendersons' house, call 911, tell them federal agents are needed immediately." Emma's eyes went wide with terror. "I can't leave you." "You have to." Sarah's voice was firm despite her breaking heart. "Protect your brother. This is the most important thing you'll ever do." Above them, something crashed to the floor. Tom's voice rose for the first time, angry now. "You have no right to destroy our home." "Rights are an interesting concept," came the smooth reply, "especially when discussing property that was never legally yours to begin with. This land has a very specific purpose, Mr. Morrison, one that your family has unfortunately disrupted." Sarah boosted Emma toward the window, then lifted Jake. The glass was old and painted shut, but desperation gave her strength. As she worked to open it, she heard new voices upstairs. More of them had arrived. Time was running out, and Sarah knew that everything they'd uncovered about the dark history of their property was about to claim new victims. The sirens wailed in the distance as Sarah clutched Emma close, both of them trembling behind the overturned workbench in the barn. Dust motes danced in the flashlight beam that cut through the darkness, and somewhere in the hidden passages behind the walls, footsteps echoed with deliberate menace. "Where's Dad?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Sarah pressed her finger to her lips, straining to hear over the sound of her own thundering heartbeat. Michael had gone to confront whoever was in the tunnels, armed with nothing but a crowbar and fierce determination to protect his family. That had been 10 minutes ago, 10 minutes that felt like hours. The barn door creaked open, and Sarah's breath caught. Heavy boots stepped across the threshold, moving with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Sarah recognized the gate immediately. Sheriff Coleman, but the relief she expected didn't come. Instead, a chill ran down her spine as she remembered the documents they'd found in the hidden room. Documents that suggested Coleman's grandfather had been involved in the underground network, that the corruption ran deeper than they'd imagined. "I know you're in here," Coleman called out, his voice echoing off the barn's rafters. "We need to talk." Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message, the screen lighting up her hiding spot. She quickly muted it, but not before catching a glimpse of the sender, Michael. Her heart leaped as she read his message, "Not Coleman. Trust no one. Stay hidden." The footsteps moved closer to their hiding spot. Sarah could see Coleman's legs through a gap in the workbench, could hear him breathing just feet away. Emma trembled against her, and Sarah had to bite her lip to keep from making a sound. "The Hartwell family thought they could disappear too," Coleman said conversationally, as if he were discussing the weather. "Thought they could take what they found and just vanish. But this land has a way of keeping its secrets, and its people." A second set of footsteps entered the barn, lighter but equally purposeful. Sarah risked a glance and saw a woman in dark clothing, someone she didn't recognize. The woman moved with military precision, checking corners and scanning the shadows with practiced efficiency. "Any sign of them?" the woman asked. "They're here," Coleman replied. "Morrison's truck is still in the driveway, and they haven't had time to get far." Not with the child. Sarah's blood ran cold. These weren't people who intended to let them walk away from this. The documents in the hidden room had revealed more than just historical corruption. They'd uncovered an active conspiracy that reached into the present day. Names of people who were supposed to be dead, bank accounts that shouldn't exist, and most damning of all, evidence of ongoing activities that certain people would kill to keep buried. The woman moved toward their hiding spot, her hand resting on something at her hip. Sarah recognized the shape, a gun. She pulled Emma closer, mind racing through their options. The barn had multiple exits, but reaching any of them would mean crossing open ground. The hidden passages Michael had discovered might offer escape routes, but they also might lead directly into the hands of whoever else was down there. A crash echoed from the direction of the house, followed by the sound of splintering wood. Coleman and the woman exchanged glances. "Check the house again," Coleman ordered. "Tear it apart if you have to. They've got those documents somewhere." As the woman headed toward the barn door, Sarah made her decision. She grabbed Emma's hand and whispered in her ear, "When I say run, you head straight for the old oak tree behind the barn. Don't look back, don't stop. Hide there until the police come. But, Mom," no arguing. "This is important." Sarah waited until Coleman moved deeper into the barn, his back turned toward them. She counted to 3, then burst from their hiding spot, pushing Emma toward the rear exit while she ran in the opposite direction, shouting to draw attention away from her daughter. Coleman spun around, his hand immediately going to his weapon. "Stop right there!" But Sarah was already diving behind a stack of hay bales, her heart pounding as she heard Emma's footsteps disappearing into the night. At least her daughter was safe. Now she just had to stay alive long enough for help to arrive. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Coleman cursed under his breath. He spoke rapidly into a radio, words Sarah couldn't quite catch but whose urgency was unmistakable. Whatever plan they'd had was falling apart. A new voice cut through the darkness. Detective Rivera's voice, calling out from somewhere near the house. Sarah's relief was overwhelming. Rivera wasn't part of this conspiracy. At least, she prayed he wasn't. Coleman raised his weapon, his face a mask of cold calculation. "Should have minded your own business, Sarah." The barn door burst open just as Coleman's finger tightened on the trigger. The sirens had finally faded into the distance, taking Harold Brennan with them. Sarah Morrison stood in the doorway of their century-old barn, watching the last police car disappear down the gravel road. The red and blue lights flickered through the oak trees one final time before vanishing completely, leaving only the golden glow of late afternoon sun streaming through the wooden slats. "Is it really over?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was sitting on an overturned crate, still clutching the leather journal they'd found in the hidden room, the journal that had ultimately brought down a man who'd spent decades covering up his father's crimes. David wrapped his arm around his daughter's shoulders. "It's over, sweetheart. Harold can't hurt anyone anymore." His voice carried the exhaustion of the past weeks, but also a profound relief. The weight that had settled over their family since they'd first discovered those hidden rooms was finally beginning to lift. Detective Martinez emerged from the barn's interior, her notebook tucked away. "We'll need the property sealed for another day or two while forensics finishes documenting everything, but after that, it's yours again." She paused, studying the family. "What you've been through, finding out your property was used to hide evidence of murder, having someone threaten your family to keep those secrets buried, most people wouldn't have had the courage to see it through." Sarah shook her head. "We didn't have a choice. Once we knew what had happened to those people, to the Clearwater family and the others, we couldn't just pretend we'd never found that room." The detective nodded. Harold's confession filled in the remaining gaps. His father, Judge Brennan, wasn't just corrupt. He was systematically eliminating anyone who threatened the land deals that made him wealthy. When the Clearwater family refused to sell their property for a fraction of its worth, he had them killed and their bodies hidden here. "The previous owners of your barn were part of the conspiracy." "But they kept records," Michael said, emerging from the shadows of the barn with dust on his clothes and cobwebs in his hair. At 15, he'd aged years in the past few weeks. Why would they document their own crimes? "Insurance," Martinez explained. "Judge Brennan kept detailed records of everything, who was involved, where the bodies were hidden, how much money changed hands. It was his way of ensuring loyalty. Everyone was implicated, so no one could betray him without destroying themselves." David looked back at the barn that had started as a simple renovation project and had nearly cost them everything. "We found more than we bargained for when we decided to fix this place up. The question now," Sarah said, "is what we do next. This barn has seen so much darkness, so much pain. Part of me wants to tear it down and start over." Emma stood up, still holding the journal. "But if we do that, we're erasing the only proof that these people existed. The Clearwater family, the others, they deserve to be remembered properly, not just as victims hidden in a secret room." Martinez's expression softened. "The families of the victims have been notified. After 73 years, they'll finally be able to lay their loved ones to rest. That's because of what you found, what you fought to preserve." As the detective's car pulled away, the Morrison family found themselves alone with their property for the first time since the nightmare began. The barn stood before them, no longer just a structure in need of renovation, but a monument to both human cruelty and the persistence of truth. "There's something else," David said quietly. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small wooden box. "I found this in the main room, while the police were processing the hidden chamber. It was tucked behind one of the support beams." He opened the box to reveal a collection of photographs, not crime scene documentation, but family pictures, children playing in a yard, a young couple on their wedding day, an elderly man teaching a boy to fish by a creek. "These must have belonged to the victims," Sarah said softly. "Personal photos they had with them when they were taken." Emma wiped away a tear. They weren't just obstacles to Judge Brennan's greed. They were people with families, with lives, with futures that were stolen from them. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across their property. The barn, which had hidden its secrets for so long, seemed different somehow, not menacing, but mournful. The truth had finally been exposed, but the weight of what had happened here would always remain. "We'll restore it properly," Sarah decided. "Not as our workshop, but as a memorial. A place where people can come to remember what happened here and honor those who were lost." David nodded. "And we'll make sure their stories are told, all of them." As darkness fell over the Morrison property, the family walked back toward their house together. Behind them, the barn stood silent in the gathering dusk, no longer a keeper of deadly secrets, but a witness to the truth that had finally, after 7 decades, set them all free.